Small CVEs didn't shine with armor, but they changed the war with an area. Convoy escort, amphibious support, new decks for every dawn. Mass destruction broke the enemy's psyche more reliably than a single supership. The story about Japanese commanders cried when they saw an American aircraft carrier built in 2 weeks sounds vividly like the headline of an evening newspaper in 1943. But it disintegrates at the first measurement with a ruler. The root of the myth is simple. They mix two different rhythms, the rhythm of launching and the actual duration of construction from laying to commissioning. A popular article about the Casablanca-class Jeep aircraft carriers once said that the second one arrived 2 weeks after the first one. It was about the calendar interval between the launches of successive hulls at the same shipyard, and not about the full construction cycle of each ship. The internet, which loves to trim the context, has turned the gap between events into a production deadline. Then the algorithms worked. The sharper the simplification, the more readily it is spread. To understand where the legend ends and the metal begins, it is enough to recall the ABC of shipbuilding. There are 3 base dates. Laying, the beginning of the hull assembly on the slipway. Launching, the hull is ready for sailing but empty inside. Commissioning, after completion, installation of mechanisms, testing and acceptance procedures. For the lead escort aircraft carrier USS Casablanca, the sequence looked like this. Laying in the fall of 1942, launching in early April 1943, and commissioning in July of the same year. Even at the peak of the assembly line, the later representatives of the series traveled the path in about 3 to 4 months from the moment of laying to delivery to the fleet. That's phenomenally fast for a ship with a flight deck, but not in 14 days. Where did the feeling of miraculous speed come from? The secret lies in the production tact. The Henry Kaiser shipyards organized the assembly in sections, in parallel on several stocks, and the assemblies were prepared in advance, like large parts of a designer. When the line gets to a steady rhythm, from the outside it looks like the ships take off, one after another, once a week. However, this does not mean that each of them is done in a week. This is a classic mass production technique. The cycle time of one product remains months, and the time between finished products at the exit is weeks. In terms of Q theory, a distinction is made between lead time, how long a product lives inside the system, and throughput clock, how often the system outputs a result. The myth was born out of the confusion of these two quantities. The comparison with Liberty's records only adds fuel to the fire. The SS Robert E. Peary cargo ship was indeed assembled in 4 days with a tail, but it was an illustrative trick based on the most unified design, without a flight deck, airframes, hangar, aircraft workshops, and fuel for aviation. Transferring this record to aircraft carriers is like measuring a marathon with a sprint stopwatch. The aircraft carrier's weight balance, superstructure aerodynamics, fuel system safety, radar and communications integration, and flight deck testing are critical. You can't speed them up with just one click. Psychology also played a role. Military memoirs and post-war articles love strong images. A forest of masts in Ulithi, decks covered with airplanes like a wheat field. For Japanese officers in the second half of the war, the surrealism of American material abundance was a real, demoralizing factor. But tears are a metaphor. Emotional hyperbole easily stuck together with the impressive statistics of serial production. 50 escort aircraft carriers in less than 2 years. Then clickbait did its thing. 50 in 2 years converged with the mass reader into 1 in 2 weeks, and then imperceptibly turned into, they built for 2 weeks. A mixer of meanings, and a new internet, truth, is ready. There is a more prosaic explanation. The language of the paper age does not match the language of social media. They say at the shipyard, the next launch is in 2 weeks. In the feed it reads like, it will be done in 2 weeks. The difference between launching and commissioning is simply not kept in everyday vocabulary. Add one more subtlety. Part of the completion took place already on the water, at the outfitting pier. For a layman, lowered sounds like ready, although months of saturation with mechanisms, cables, pipelines, inspections, sea trials and flight tests are ahead. That same invisible workfront rarely gets into the frame, so it easily disappears from memory. Finally, the temptation of miracles is an old disease of the history of technology. We love stories about genes and secret technologies, because they remove the boring need to count. The real miracle of World War II is not in the magical 2-week speed, but in a controlled, disciplined mass scale. Standards, logistics, personnel training, lending, steel distribution, and assembly line redrawing. This is not a headline. This is a table. But it is the table that explains why, by 1944, the ocean was filled with dozens of inexpensive, albeit vulnerable, but useful escort aircraft carriers. So, the myth is sorted out by the cogs. There is a gulf of methodology between a new building was lowered twice a month and the building was built in 2 weeks. If you replace the emotional spotlight with a chronometer, the picture does not become less impressive. It's just that instead of a fairy tale, engineering appears. Calendar schedules, the rhythm of slipways, flows of materials, and the inevitable bottlenecks that the American industry systematically expanded. In the next chapter, we will have to move from exposure to the mechanics of the miracle. How exactly did the Kaiser assembly line work? What solutions made it possible to keep the 1 descent per week pace? And why such production has become a strategic weapon no less than an aircraft wing on deck. To understand why the escort aircraft carriers fell into the ocean as if from a factory tape, you need to look not at the deck, but into the workshop. Henry Kaiser came to shipbuilding from a world of gigantic infrastructures. Dams, roads, concrete, time, and budget. He does not think like a ship, but like a stream. Therefore, instead of a sacred slipway with a single brainchild, he builds a system. Parallel slipways, procurement workshops, section warehouse, completion berths, logistics of nodes, work cycle. The ship is no longer grown. It is assembled as a huge but standardized set. The key is a preliminary sectional assembly. Flat panels, box blocks, superstructure elements, and even deck fragments were assembled in indoor workshops on slipway fittings, where welding was faster, smoother, and more weather-independent. Each block had templates and control points so that when docking on an open slipway, seams and diagonals would not start dancing. The crane feeds the section. The crew fixes it. The welders close the lock. The next section is already waiting. In parallel, the same scene is going on in another building, but with a section of a different nomenclature. This is how the famous 1 descent per week feeling is born. The actual cycle of each building is longer, but the product output of the line is rhythmic. The second pillar is strict unification. The Casablanca-class is intentionally lightweight. The same length, width, power circuit, set of mechanisms, repeating cable and pipe routes. The same skeleton for 50 buildings means not just saving drawings, but speed of decision-making. Changes have been made, of course, but the rule is simple. All adjustments are packaged and implemented in batches, so as not to break the cycle. Romantics are sad, ships without individuality, and the production worker smiles. The fewer unique details, the closer the schedule is to the calendar. The third element is the separation of bottlenecks. An aircraft carrier is not just a hull and a deck. These are energy, flight control, radar, aviation fuel, aero finishers, workshops, and living quarters. Kaiser divides responsibility. The hulls and superstructures go to the shipyard. The main machinery and boilers come from predictable external chains. The aircraft equipment and landing system cables go as a set, in boxes, and are mounted already at the completion dock. As a result, the slipway is freed from small things. And the scheme looks like this. On the slipway, iron. At the outfitting pier, nerves and vessels. Hence the phenomenon. The ship is lowered, but the line does not stop, because the completion has been moved to another zone and other crews. The fourth whale is humans. Kaiser Shipyards teaches beginners through accelerated programs, breaks down operations into understandable, repeatable, safe movements. Where the classic fleet lived in guilds, instruction maps, rationing, and quality control rule here. The shifts are full of those who didn't hold the burner yesterday. Men who came from agriculture, women from offices and shops. Infrastructure is being set up for them. Buses to the gates, canteens, changing rooms, medical centers. The model of an employee comes to the assembly line, and the conveyor adapts to the employee, gives rise to what we today call an industrial culture. And yes, the byproduct of this culture will be the employer's famous medical system. Another touch to how shipbuilding flows into social engineering. The fifth factor is welding technique and deformation control. Fast does not mean by eye. The warm metal leads, the plates warp, the seams pull the geometry. The Kaiser team works using seam maps, sets potholders in a preset sequence, dispenses heat, and uses templates and reference frames to check diagonals. Arrows are caught early, while the block is still being turned by the crane, and not when the entire board is already sitting crookedly. This is where the reputation of cheap but smooth ships is born. Not elite, but without surprises in the line of shafts and deck landing. The power plant is also a choice in favor of serial production and availability. An escort does not need the speed of an attack aircraft carrier. It is enough to walk with your convoy and manage to release or receive aircraft. Therefore, they choose not the scarce turbines of the linear fleet, but simpler and more quickly accessible machines and boilers, standardized fittings, automatic valves and pumps. As a result, expensive and rare high-turnover exotics give way to workhorses that supply several factories under contracts at once, and the shipyard only reduces the kit in the hull. A separate magic is deck farming. The flight deck, like a huge workbench, requires precise geometry and careful cladding, slats, sheets, dampers, fastening to the frames. The assembly is carried out by semi-devices. First the power beams, then the flooring, then the equipment, cables and markings. The springboard from the romance of flying disappears, and the engineering of lines and levels remains. There is also an ejection zone, finishers, and barriers. All this web comes in sets, so that the installation does not run into the search for another cowhand. If the kit is delayed, the entire ship is not idle. The work is being moved to another site because the tape is multi-track. The logistics of materials looks like a circulatory system. Steel, rolled products, electrical cables, fasteners, paints. Everything is on schedule, in containers, labeled for specific blocks and orders. The supply plan is synchronized with the slipway schedule. Delays are visible in advance on the dispatcher's board. Therefore, a weekly rhythm of descents is obtained. There is more mathematics than heroics here, calculating the power of cranes, gate capacity, cart turnover, and range of movement. Of course, they pay for speed. Escorts are more thinly protected, more fire-prone in case of heavy hits, and more sensitive to overloading with aviation fuel and ammunition. But this is a conscious compromise. They do not rush against battleships but cover convoys, carry planes, jam submarines, and support landings. The massive jeep closes a dozen niches for which the supercarrier is too expensive and rare. And here the assembly line beats piece production with what it always beats: the availability, right now, and the number, in place. In the bottom line, Kaiser Conveyor is not a beautiful slogan, but a set of boring but crucial solutions. Sections under the roof, tact and dispatching, unification of kits, dilution of bottlenecks, welding engineering, training of mass personnel, social infrastructure around the gates. In total, they turn the exotic aircraft carrier into a repeatable product. That is why by the middle of the war, rhythmic marks of descents appear on the shipyard's calendar, and in the fleet reports, the phrase monotonous as the sound of rain. Another escort has been commissioned. In the next chapter, this production. Metronome will become strategic music, how jeeps filled operational voids, how convoys and landings changed, and why mass production itself turned out to be a weapon no weaker than carrier-based aircraft. The escort aircraft carrier looks modest. A short deck, a cramped hangar, a small crew, barely 24 planes. You can't even show it in an advertising booklet next to big attack ships. It will get lost. But war is not an advertising stand, but a system of equations. And in this system, small aircraft carriers solved several tasks at once, which large ones solved poorly, irregularly, or too expensively. Their strength lies in covering the area and time. They did not break the enemy at the front. They covered the sea like a net. The first layer of the grid is anti-submarine defense. Wolf packs of submarines preferred to hunt in areas where aircraft could not reach the shore. CVEs were integrated into convoys as mobile airfields. A pair of Avenger units for patrols and depth charges, a dozen light and tenacious FM2s to suppress surfaced boats and protect against scouts. No steel curtain of destroyers without an eye in the sky works. The air group indicated its presence every few hours, driving the submarines underwater, cutting off their speed and initiative. Even when the attacks did not happen, the effect was measurable. The convoy marched in a disciplined manner. False contacts were dealt with faster, and nervous tension decreased. At the statistical level, this turned into everyday formulas: fewer losses, higher average transition speed, and predictable schedule. The second layer is an air bridge. The big aircraft carriers were fighting, and the jeeps were being driven. Planes for frontline units were flown and transported to them. Spare engines, weapons, and technical calculations were delivered. In the logic of the Pacific Ocean, where distances were measured in thousands of miles, the role of these flying trucks is difficult to overestimate. The landing is planned by calendar, not inspiration. The presence of 10 more serviceable Avengers at the right point on the right day could decide the fate of a particular strip of beach no worse than the heroic strike of the squadron. And again, the key is massive. When you have dozens of platforms, you can block several routes at the same time and not depend on the whims of a single giant. The third layer is artillery on call for paratroopers. In the early stages of the landings, the infantry often ran into an invisible enemy. Observers, mortars, batteries, which opened only when moving. The CVE Light Air Group hung close, and for a long time, worked in short flights, and relied on simple communication channels between the navigation groups and the shore and fire support ships. This is not a parade carrier-based aircraft with long-range strikes. It is a craft. Find, mark, enter, demolish, return, refuel, get back in the air. The rhythm is shallower but more stable. The troops know that their friends are at the top, that they will appear in half an hour, and that they can be called again. As a result, the front line was less dependent on the vagaries of the weather and occasional pauses. The fourth layer is flies against the Tiger, the famous battles at Samara. Formally, the jeeps are not designed to take on heavy ships, but war loves exceptions. When light formations came face to face with Japanese battleships and cruisers, it wasn't tonnage that helped, but determination, improvisation, and risk. Scattered attacks by torpedo bombers and fighters, smokescreens, false targets, and the tenacity of captains. All this did not turn CVE into battleship killers, but forced the enemy to overestimate the picture of the battle, slow down, and make the wrong decisions. The striking power of the jeeps was limited, but the psychological power was not. The very fact that another airfield suddenly appeared on the horizon changed the calculations. It is also important how CVE changed the daily culture of the fleet. Large aircraft carriers are a piece-by-piece commodity. They are protected. They are dosed with risks. Escorts are a consumable resource in the good sense of the word. They are put where it is boring and long, where perseverance is needed, not fireworks. The commanders learned to think square, not with an ideal strike, but with a reliable presence. I got into the habit of solving hundreds of small tasks instead of one big one. In production, this is the logic of the assembly line. In war, it is the logic of exhausting the enemy's initiative. Now about the psychology of the opponent. The Japanese officers were not naive. They saw the thin armor of the CVE, knew about their vulnerability to fires and torpedo hits. But it wasn't every single deck that demoralized them, but the number of decks in total. In supply bases like Ulithi or Espirito Santo, a forest of antenna masts and mooring lines grew in a matter of days. Intelligence reports honestly recorded. More entered. Arrived. Losses replaced. The serial formula seeped into consciousness. Whatever you sink today, another one will come out of the fog tomorrow. It's hard to argue with such a machine, not only with fire but also with hope. There is also a downside. Mass participation is not a magic wand. The losses of the escorts were real and painful, especially in episodes of large explosions of ammunition and fuel. The lightweight design, low speed, and reduced emergency teams all cost lives. But then the same logic of the system affected. When the cheap good enough platform quickly returns to the line, the strategic balance shifts. The enemy spends elite crews and torpedoes on targets that the industry replenishes faster than it uses its strike force. In a long game, this works like a discount. Losses, today, are overlaid by the time, tomorrow. That is why, by the end of the war, CVE turned into a kind of ocean background. Their presence became the norm. They marched with convoys, loomed in the landing strips, drove equipment, covered the rear. Big battles collect textbook pages, but victories are often forged by background processes. An escort aircraft carrier is not a legend, but a statistic. You don't notice it until it disappears. And the Allies made sure that it never disappeared. The shipyard schedule, the convoy schedule, the schedule of operations. The result is a new type of strategic weapon. Not a single super object, but a repeatable unit multiplied by an organization. They cannot be romanticized as miracle ships. But they were the ones who sealed communications, put the squeeze on the underwater threat, stabilized the landings, and deprived the enemy of the illusion that a strike on one group would decide the outcome of the campaign. The small fleet turned out to be a fleet of sustainability. And if there is a moral to the history of technology, it is simple. Sometimes the correct answer is not more, but a lot.